Thank you for joining us for the final panel in our series, Exploring the Future of Energy. My name is Julie Wagner, and I'm the Interim Director of the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at the Leeds School of Business. Our center is focused on connecting the Leeds School with the sustainable business community. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the University of Colorado is located on the traditional territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. In addition, 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. I'd like to thank Amy Haddon from Schneider Electric, Matt Futch and our moderator Ellen Morris from NREL, and my colleague Justine Roberts for their hard work to create this panel series. I'm also deeply grateful to our panelists for sharing their expertise with us today. Dr. Ellen Morris is the Director of University Partnerships Program at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. She also teaches energy and development courses at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and is a faculty affiliate at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Morris is launching a new program at NREL that builds and strengthens partnerships with leading universities and research institutions, leveraging NREL's scientific knowledge and state-of-the-art facilities to solve complex multidisciplinary challenges in energy efficiency, sustainable transportation, renewable power technologies, and grid integration. Dr. Morris is a world-recognized expert on international development and energy, with a particular focus on policy analysis, research, and strategy development on energy access, gender equality, and business models for the base of the pyramid. Prior to joining NREL, Morris served as president of Sustainable Energy Solutions and was also a founder of Embark Energy, a social enterprise that trained and mentored energy entrepreneurs in Tanzania, and ARC Finance, a nonprofit that expands access to financing for energy, water, and other basic needs to build the income and assets of poor people around the world. Morris received her bachelor's degree in geophysical engineering from the Colorado School of Mines and her doctorate in geological oceanography at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. Ellen, please take it away.
We're discussing access to energy from a range of different perspectives, highlighting how companies and communities are partnering to make energy more accessible, sustainable, and cost-effective in different settings. And we have a panel of three people: Emmeline Lepoux from Schneider, Carla Fredericks from the University of Colorado Law School and First Peoples Worldwide, and Byron Komanek from Jack's Solar Garden. And I'll introduce each of them as we go through the webinar more completely. But before we get started, I just wanted to provide some context for what we mean by energy access and why this is such an important issue at both the global and national scale. Worldwide, there are around 1 billion people without access to electricity, mainly in developing countries, but not all, as you'll find out in this panel. Lack of access to electricity and modern energy options create severe constraints on economic productivity, access to health and education, protection of the environment, and the overall well-being of people and communities. Moreover, in addition to the 1 billion people without access to electricity, an equal number of people in the world don't necessarily have access to reliable electricity. So, although you might be connected to the electricity grid, you might only have it available for a few hours a day or not at all for many days. And you can imagine how it would be not to have electricity reliably. And that is a major problem as well. And because access to electricity and energy more generally is the underpinning of development, it's important to think about how to make it affordable and accessible and available to all people. This is a topic that we're here to discuss today with this panel, including how access to energy needs to be considered in light of the appropriate technology solutions for a given context, the different business models for providing affordable options and financing for both the customer and the business, the policy and regulatory safeguards for equity and inclusion, and most importantly, we need to think about how these different aspects of energy access, from the business to the policy to the technology solution, how they all act in unison and how these different aspects of energy access operate in a holistic manner that ultimately maximizes the benefits for people and communities, because that's the bottom line, increasing energy access in an affordable and sustainable way. So today we're privileged to have 3 excellent speakers who will each have around 10 to 12 minutes in total to give a brief presentation, followed by 1 to 2 questions from me. And please remember to put your questions or discussion points into the chat window as we go, and we will get to those in the last 15 minutes of the session. So today we'll start with Emmeline Lepout, who is the Strategy and Performance Director on Access to Energy at Schneider Electric. Emmeline has been at Schneider since 2011, initially as Sustainability Performance Manager, and in 2019, she joined the Access to Energy team at Schneider as the Strategy and Performance Lead. She coordinates all the different arms of the program of energy access, from social and inclusive business to impact investing and capacity building. And as part of this role, she defines the expected long-term impacts of their programs and their metrics for success. So we're going to have Emmeline talk, and she's going to really talk about Schneider as a company and the energy access priorities and an introduction to something called the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll turn it over to you, Emmeline.
Thank you. Thank you for the great introduction.
Sure.
So I have a few slides to share with you. So as an introduction, so maybe a few words about Schneider. Who is Schneider, and why we are interested of this topic, access to electricity. So can you see my slides? Everything's okay?
Yes, but it's not on full screen.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so at Schneider, in a few words, so we provide digital solutions for our customers for better management of the energy and also for automation. So they are more efficient and more sustainable. We are a global company headquartered in France. You have some figures here about the size of the company. So why access to energy? You understand with this slide that the mainstream customers of Schneider consume a lot of energy. We help them to reduce it, but we know that at the worldwide level, pictures from Schneider project. The first one in India, where we support farmers for agricultural solutions, for water pumping solutions. In the middle, it's in Ghana, we support training centers that have a specificity that is to attract a minimum of 80% women. And the last one is a company that we support with our impact fund. So we not only promote Schneider products, but also products from other startups. So yes, the SDGs, here we arrived to the SDGs because in my previous job, I was in charge of relationship with socially responsible investors, among other things. And it was in 2011, before the SDGs. And when I spoke to the investors, I had much difficulty to explain that access to electricity was a basic human right, because in, let's say, the general opinion, access to our basic human rights were access to water, to sanitation, to food, and so on. And electricity was not a priority. And thanks to the SDGs, now we have sustainable development goals focused on affordable and clean energy. And I know, I must say that much progress has been done in the global opinion about the fact that access to electricity was a fundamental need for socioeconomic development. It's a first step, and it's an enabler of many other SDGs. And in our access to energy program, we have 6 main impacts that we target, let's say, which are agriculture, as I told you, with products that help productivity for smallholder farmers. Also health, because both we can electrify health centers, but also we know that when you replace a kerosene lamp with a solar lamp, your health is improving also. Education, both the same, because we can electrify school, but we know also that the first motivation from a family who buy a solar home system is for their own children to have more time at home at night to study. Also women, because we know that when there is access to electricity in a community, women get empowered first, both in their personal life, because they have more time at home to do other things. For example, also develop economic activity. But also we know that in front of their husband, they have more voices when they have electricity at home. So both from a personal and professional life, it's an empowerment enabler for women. And emergency, we work a lot with refugee camps. For example, we are a preferred partner of UNHCR with our solar lantern to equip the tents of UNHCR. And we know that these camps are not temporary, and they have to be considered as cities, so with a need for infrastructure. It's not only a question of solar lanterns, but we also provide training. We also equip health centers in those camps. So this is a whole topic to be addressed in access to electricity. And the last one is community, when you electrify a home, a village, and so on. So this is the main impacts. And then you can see that at the second step, with access to electricity, you can help people get out of poverty, have a better impact on climate, and so on. You have everything in this slide. So it's really the main message is that access to electricity can really improve the life of people in developing countries.
Great. Thank you, Emmeline, for that really wonderful review of Schneider, which is a truly global company with a lot of impact in developing countries. And your description of the Sustainable Development Goals is important because it really focuses on many of the underserved areas in the world. And some of those most underserved areas for electricity in developing countries, and a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, are the more remote rural areas where poverty rates are particularly high, and access to many of the benefits of energy you just mentioned are not possible. So what are the ways that Schneider Electric as a company and as a corporate and social responsibility issue see these rural areas as a potential market for their products? And how is Schneider entering these markets of the rural unserved people in developing countries?
Yes. Yes, very interesting question. I would say first that if your motivation is only a business and find new markets for your company products, you're going the wrong way because it's a difficult market. So I think the motivation has to be found in the concept of purpose. As I said, for example, with access to energy at Schneider, we enrich the mission of Schneider. Without it, it's the last piece to complete this mission of delivering electricity for everyone, everywhere, at every moment. So this is a question of purpose, of having the will to a more inclusive world, and helping people get out of poverty, so that they are actors of their own development. But so just to answer your question, how we do, so first we develop a specific range of products. We don't sell only, it can happen, but we don't sell mainstream Schneider products. It's a specific range. So as I said, from solar lanterns, solar home systems, microgrids. Of course, Schneider mainstream business also developed microgrids, but here we had to focus on the lower power range of microgrids, and also another range around the containerized microgrids that are dedicated to this access to energy market. And also, but we do a lot in-house. So from research and development up to distribution of the products, we do it on our own, but we cannot do everything alone. So the question of access channels is key in how we enter this market. And basically, very typically, we will partner with social companies or NGOs. And for example, I showed you this picture of the woman in India. For this project, we are working with an NGO that is settled in India for 30 years. And what they do is that when a staff is entering the NGO, he has to stay a few months in a tribal village to understand how people live, and to also help them develop, speak about their development needs, and to get trust. And then few years after, we can start to let's say, to develop a project with the village. So we partner with the NGO that is locally settled, and it takes a long time before we start to it's a lot of discussions with the villages. They need also to gather in self-help groups, and so what we want also is that they participate in the capex, first initial capex of the system. So they need to have a certain trust in the results, that they will, the promise is that they can double their income in 5 years, because they don't only, they are not waiting for the monsoon once a year, but they can have several crops a year. So in 5 years, they can double the income. So it takes a long time, and then other farmers can see the results of the first group, and the year after they say, oh, okay, I want the same. So that's it. I won't be too long. So the relationship partnership with social enterprises or NGOs is really key in entering the market.
Great. And, I think you've really touched on the point of appropriate technology and affordability, and as a global company, making sure that you're doing products that are fit for the markets you're working in, with the possibility to expand into other products as the countries develop. And I'm just mindful of the time, so I think I'll skip my second question for now, and maybe circle back during the question and answer period, if that is okay with you, Emmeline.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So next up we have Carla Fredericks, who is the director of the American Indian Law Clinic at the University of Colorado Law School, and director of First Peoples Worldwide, which advocates for Indigenous people in business and industry. So Carla brings deep expertise in Indigenous peoples law, federal Indian law, sustainable economic development, including renewable energy development, and human rights in business and finance. She really does it all, and with a very small team, as I gather. So they're a very strong and powerful group. Among several current projects, First Peoples is incubating a private equity fund that supports sustainable resource development and entrepreneurship in Indian country, and is also a representative on the Gwich'in Steering Committee to protect sacred lands in the Arctic Refuge. She is a graduate of University of Colorado and the Columbia Law School. So we're super pleased to have you here, Carla, today to talk on a different aspect of energy access here in our own country in the US. And if you could sort of describe a bit for us the situation on tribal lands in terms of some of the challenges you see that you've seen related to energy and water, et cetera. And also the role of your group, First Peoples, in terms of addressing some of these issues. So I'll give the floor to you, Carla, and then we'll follow up with some questions after that.
Sure. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Julie and CESR, for putting all of this together. It's a very important topic, and I'm very happy to have been asked to participate. I want to back up a little bit out of the domestic landscape and back into the global landscape for Indigenous peoples. In thinking about all of this, all these topics for discussion today, we had Indigenous Peoples Day here in the US on Monday. And what we saw in celebration of that day and reclamation of that day from Columbus Day is that really what's going on in the US represents a global landscape as well. And so I really want to pick up on some of what's been said already about the Sustainable Development Goals. And then I'd like to sort of map that discussion onto what's going on here in the US. So as the last presenter mentioned, what we're really wrestling with here is access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable clean energy. And that's really the heart of what's encapsulated in Goal 7 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we think about the issues that affect all of us, but particularly the issues that affect Indigenous people, we have a situation where energy supply really accounts for 60% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is what the UN and participating nations throughout the world are very concerned about, that only 17% of energy consumption is now met with renewables. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that this really needs to hit 85% by 2050, because otherwise we're facing and actually currently experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. And so where Indigenous peoples fit into all of this is that Indigenous peoples are holding a lot of land and have land rights and connection to lands that are both negatively impacted by extractive industry development and then have the potential to participate in boosting the production and consumption of renewable energy. And so while representing only 5% of the global population, Indigenous peoples make up actually 1/3 of the world's 900 million extremely poor rural people. And so as we think about the potential for development, we also have to understand that there's also an inverse to that, where Indigenous people don't have access to energy while they're a critical demographic that needs to be put at the center of this global dialogue. And so that is a difficult situation in and of itself, but then there's also a real problem of invisibility when it comes to the global understanding about energy access. And there's a real lack of disaggregated information that's specific to Indigenous people about how these situations impact them, or how they interplay with their existence as peoples. And so while Indigenous territories are hosting renewable energy projects, there's also a problem about how these renewable energy projects are permitted and constructed without respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so the activities to implement a very laudable goal that's encapsulated in SDG 7 and to promote renewable energy under the Paris Agreement and other initiatives, they really have to map back to international human rights norms and laws relating to Indigenous peoples. And so I thought I would share for folks who may not know what the landscape is there. So in 2007, the UN adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And what that really says is that Indigenous rights are human rights, and it articulates what the human rights norms and expectations are for Indigenous people. And for Indigenous people globally and Indigenous people here in the US, the core of those rights is self-determination, that Indigenous people and tribal nations have the right to self-determination and sovereignty over issues that impact them. And so what does that mean in the landscape of renewable energy? It means that renewable energy projects have to be aligned with respect and protection of Indigenous rights. And that the protection of these rights really has to be in place to prevent adverse impacts of renewable energy development in these communities. It can't go along as extractive industry energy development has. It has to be different, and Indigenous communities have to be empowered in their self-determination of sustainable development. What we're seeing here in the US that maps back to that is that tribal nations are very keen to develop their resources, but that these resources cannot be developed even in a renewable manner if the tribes are not really fully engaged on board and have decision-making authority over the projects. I noticed actually in the audience that Tangshi Claremont is here today with us, and I really hope that at some point in the Q&A or at an appropriate time we can hear from her, because she is really on the ground with a very important project down on the Navajo Nation to actualize some of these aims that I'm talking about and objectives to interconnect tribal and Indigenous rights with renewable energy. So I will leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any further questions from the audience or from you, Alan.
Yeah, I just had a question for you, and it sort of fits nicely with your statement around renewable energy and clean energy of interest to tribal nations, and that transition to renewable energy in the US and globally is happening much more rapidly as cost of renewables go down and coal-fired power plants are decommissioned because they no longer can be cost competitive. And just thinking about the context of the tribal nations here in North America, and how do you ensure that you get to that green energy economy in a just and fair way for Indigenous people? And thinking about your very spot on comment about people's rights being respected and aligned, or the rights of the people being recognized and respected as projects are developed, so that we can do things differently and better than the very poor track record of the extractive industry. So just wondering how you see that happening from your vantage point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about operationalizing the right. And one of the things that's exciting about this panel and where it's situated is, it's really the business orientation of all of this, where a lot of this happens, because businesses really have a key role to play, and frankly, a responsibility to ensure that the human rights are protected and operationalized as envisioned in the global consensus. So I think that, it's really about partnership. The Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals has a set of partnership principles that I can share. It's about respecting and upholding human rights as a core, particularly the right to free, prior, and informed consent. Also equitable benefit sharing and promotion of equity. So it's not about just supporting, wealthier community members who can participate, but really thinking through wealth and power gaps and making sure that that it's inclusive of more marginalized people within the community, including people with disabilities and the elderly. Inclusion and empowerment of Indigenous women. That's a core objective of the Indigenous Peoples Partner Major Group Initiative. Self-determined sustainable development. So really thinking about what it is that the community wants from a culturally sensitive lens, a holistic approach. And then full participation and empowerment throughout the pendency of the project. So what we see in the extractive context and what we've also seen in the renewable context is that Indigenous land rights holders kind of become passive landlords in these projects, and they permit, and the project gets permitted and the land gets leased, and there's a whole process for that in the United States. But then they're sort of out of the picture in terms of decision making, and in order to really encapsulate the vision of human rights and free, prior, and informed consent in the UN Declaration, that needs to be continuous, and there needs to be a participatory approach that's community-led and centered. And then also, just really walking the walk on Indigenous leadership. It can tend to get a little transactional when you're in the business context. And I think a real respect for Indigenous leadership and governance needs to be in there to disrupt, a more transactional parity approach. And then finally, these projects would really benefit, I think, from transparency and mutual respect and accountability, because that's the core of what partnership is. And anyone, who's ever been in a true partnership or relationship understands that. And I think that just upholding those principles is super important to build trust, which is something that has been mentioned already on this panel.
Wow, thanks, Carla. You know, having spent much of my career working in sub-Saharan Africa, from the community level up to the ministerial level, so much of what you say related to Indigenous people in the US, and it really resonates with many of the issues that you see and need to take care of in many of the countries that I've worked on in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's just such an interesting connection between, you know, two different entry points from yours and from mine to see how they sort of align so amazingly. So thank you for that, and thanks for your excellent work in that area. And now our final speaker is Byron Komanek, who is the, again, another local person. He's the owner and manager of Jack's Solar Garden, which is a social enterprise in Boulder County with a 1.2 megawatt Agrovoltaics community solar garden. He will explain more about that in his remarks. And he's also on the Pollution Prevention Advisory Board for the state of Colorado, which is an appointment made by Governor Polis in July 2020. Byron served in the Peace Corps in Cameroon and West Africa, as well as working for the U.S. Agency for International Development on projects related to forestry and wildlife conservation. He holds a Master's of Science in Environmental Engineering from the University of North Carolina and a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from University of Iowa. So Byron will talk a little bit about Jack's Solar Garden and introduce us to that amazing enterprise that's in our backyard here of Boulder, and talk about some key aspects of his business model around community solar. So Byron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks folks for having me. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Byron Komanek. As Ellen mentioned, I'm the owner and manager of Jack's Solar Garden. We're a 1.2 megawatt community solar garden here in Boulder County. What that means is we're able to interconnect our 3,276 solar panels into Xcel Energy's electricity grid, and that's able to power over 300 homes. And we intend to flip on the switch for our solar array at the end of this month to start producing that power. The history of Jack's Solar Garden starts with my grandfather. He purchased our land back in 1972. Our land is just off of North 95th Street, about a mile south of Oscar Blues. If you hop onto Google Maps, you can put in Jack's Solar Garden and find where we're at. We have 24 acres of land, and we've mainly been doing hay for the past 40, 50 years. And these days, hay doesn't really pay the bills. It can't pay for the combination of our property tax plus water rights plus utilities. I can't even go to the grocery store on what our land produces. Some of that is certainly the management of our land, and some of it is also just how our land has been managed over the past so that our soils aren't able to produce more. So we decided that we would go down a path of trying to figure out what else to do with our land. And that started off in 2016 when I moved back from overseas and onto our farmland to figure out what else we could do. Should we go into doing thousands of free-range chickens? Should we have a Christmas tree farm? Should we have an equestrian center like some of our neighbors? Or do we put our land into the conservation easement by Boulder County? And a lot of those options seem to be rather difficult or not exactly what we wanted to do. And also Boulder County had said that we were too small to be able to incorporate into their easement program. So we felt like we were at a loss until a friend of mine came along and said, you know, your land's really good for a solar garden for this. So in 2017, we started pushing Boulder County to see if we could have a community solar garden on our farmland. And the answer at that time was no way. Farmland is farmland, it's not for solar. And we pushed back saying we're just growing hay. So let's work something out here. And for about a year, they worked on updating their land use code and changed it by the end of 2018. So not only our farm could do a solar array on our farmland in Boulder County, but also over 50 other farms around our area could do the same thing, as long as they incorporate either pollinator habitat or agriculture with it. At the same time, we won our bid with Xcel Energy to interconnect our 1.2 megawatt system. And along the way, we were collecting a variety of partnerships. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Colorado State University, and the University of Arizona are all interested in using our land to study growing crops underneath and around solar panels. That's agrovoltaics. We also have Sprout City Farms that's coming on board to actually farm 3 out of our 5 acres of solar panels to create a new vocation to train young farmers on how to go to other people's solar arrays to farm and keep the soils underneath those panels active. We're also working with Audubon Rockies, who fundraised to plant over 3,000 perennials that form the vegetative barrier around our solar array. So we don't actually have a fence; it's a vegetative barrier, which will allow for a bird habitat to be adjacent to the solar array, so that the Audubon Rockies can see what it's like having birds very close to the solar array. To get down this path, we've had to have a variety of subscribers get involved. So Boulder County was our first large subscriber, buying in at 10% of our grid. That really helped show the community that the local government is behind us, and that helped provide us capital for our solar array. City of Boulder also did the same thing, around 4.25%. And then In the Flow Cannabis Company actually bought or purchased 25% of our grid. And they'll be a great supporter for years to come. And we have a variety of residents that are also buying into the program that I can also explain if folks have on that. But I wanted to hop into a little bit onto agrovoltaics and what that is, and thinking about getting people to understand that the solar panels are simply a tree canopy where there are no trees. What a tree canopy does is it helps to reduce evapotranspiration, meaning that there's more moisture left in the soil for plants to be able to access. And in arid climates like what we have, that's really essential. Like water is one of the limiting factors here for plant growth. The solar panels can also help protect crops beneath it from damaging winds or from hail damage. The solar panels provide more shade that helps to reduce stresses when it's really hot during July and August, so that if stresses on plants are reduced, they can continue producing sugars without actually shutting down. So you can continue to have those crops produce the fruits that we want to harvest later on. Our solar array also has two different heights of it. So 2/3 of our solar array is at 6 feet high, whereas another third of it is at 8 feet high. And all sections of it are single axis tracking. That difference in height enables our researchers to study the different microclimates underneath the two different heights of panels, so that we can go off and tell other farms what it would be like of having a 6-foot panel versus having an 8-foot panel on their property. And the whole intention of what we're doing is trying to keep our soils active, as opposed to graveling the area or having weeds grow underneath of it that basically turns the soil inert and only able to produce solar power. So this is a strategic land use management style where we're trying to stack functions and get as much out of our land as possible.
Wow, that's really awesome to hear about, and it's just great to hear about the village that you've built up to make this all happen with all the partnerships. And just Byron, a question on this is, your work is really cutting edge in terms of thinking of the energy, food, water nexus, and because I'm really proud of what NREL is doing in partnering with you in some of the research and all your other partners that I now have heard about. But on this new emerging area of agrovoltaics, how do you see this rolling out in developing countries? Some of the places where Emmeline is really active, where there, are severe challenges around food scarcity and drought and energy access. How do you've mentioned it a bit about the tree canopy and the water retention and things, but in your sort of forward-looking vision, and having worked in a developing country yourself, how do you see agrovoltaics sort of rolling out in some of these sort of remote places in say sub-Saharan Africa?
Sure, and as I mentioned prior, we're in a semi-arid climate here in the Front Range of Colorado, and agrovoltaics works best in those more arid and very sunny climates like what we have here, as the solar panels reduce that evapotranspiration from the soils, thereby conserving more moisture in the ground for plants to access. That isn't to say that agrovoltaics would only work in such climates. More humid climates could also use solar panels to the shade of those solar panels for growing mushrooms beneath them. Agrovoltaics also offers versatility, as solar panels can be fixed south facing, or it can be single axis tracking, or lowered or elevated to different heights, or even strung up on cables to reduce the number of poles that you're putting into the ground. Agrovoltaics is being used in Europe to grow fruit trees and wine grapes and potatoes underneath it. In Asia, it's being used for fruiting perennials like goji berries and also mushroom growth in Japan. In the US, we're trying a variety of different types of vegetables, some hot peppers, and soon I understand that there's going to be a massive solar array built over a cranberry bog. In developing countries, Agrovoltaics can be used to keep farmland productive while also providing decentralized power to communities. Countries experiencing desertification may look to agrivoltaics as a means for keeping more moisture in the soils to grow grasses or other vegetation on the boundaries of a desert to keep it from encroaching on farmland. In developing countries where they have harvested many of their trees and it's completely deforested, leaving the soils to bear the brunt of the extreme weather, putting solar panels on deforested lands may actually help to retain that moisture enough to improve the soil so that you start having vegetation. So I want folks to think of solar panels as a versatile technology that can be designed in whatever way you need for making your soils more productive in the way that you want to.
Yeah, and I think that just the connection to some of these microgrids that Schneider is doing and other remote solar installations, the crops underneath is really a very not a heavy lift. I would say they're already growing crops that aren't necessarily doing as well as they could do. So by having this sort of value add to the remote solar installations and others, it would be really great. So thank you for that really awesome introduction to what you're doing. It's really fantastic. So now I'm going to open it up to the group, questions coming in. And I see one from Gregor Hens, who's on the faculty at CU. Hi, Gregor. And this is for you, Byron. It says, how do you balance insulation for plant growth and solar power harvesting? Too much shading cannot be good, right? That's from Greg.
A lot of the solar arrays being built are the leading edge of the solar panel, as in the edge of the solar panel that is closest to the ground is between 6 inches to 2 feet off the ground. As I mentioned, our panels are at 6 feet and 8 feet high. That would be to be able to shade the solar panels with the vegetation. Now you're trying to grow trees there. As I mentioned, in Europe, where they're actually growing trees underneath solar panels, they're elevating the panels to 12 to 15 feet high and stringing them up on cables. You can design the system to not be shaded by the crops or the vegetation that you want to grow underneath of it. Yeah.
Okay. And then from Amy Haddon, who's at Schneider, Emmeline's colleague. I assume this might be for Emmeline, but it could be for others as well. It says, access to energy and digital is a growing need among homeless and other underserved populations in the US, and people of color and the poor also bear a pollution and waste burden, unlike the wealthier folks. How can the work with community solar and indigenous groups translate into broader energy access in the US? Carla, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, I was actually thinking about this, Ellen, when you were kind of wrapping up and summarizing comments. I think that, Indigenous communities are small rural communities that have a long history of engagement with one another about decision making. And I think that one thing that we're seeing right now in this country is a lack of ability for us to come together around issues that are very pressing for our communities. And my hope would be that some of the modalities through which Indigenous people are really engaging in some of these difficult questions and conversations might be a good model to export community engagement elsewhere. So I think that there's like a whole spectrum of possibilities at the community level and then at the global and domestic policy level of how the particular situation with Indigenous peoples might help tease out some issues that are consonant for the broader society. And I'll just kind of leave it there because I think that there's also aspects of this question that could be answered by the other panelists as well.
Yeah, and I think you've really touched on the need to really learn from those kinds of long-standing ways to engage and respect different opinions to come to a consensus solution that is for the greater good. And I think there's a lot of learning to be done from Indigenous people in the North America, as well as in developing countries, where that community social fabric is so important and long-standing that there is a lot of things to be taken from that. Does anyone else want to talk about that in terms of how it might translate, this work with community solar and Indigenous people might translate into the broader energy access? Byron, did you want to just add on to yours, or Emmeline?
Community solar is an ability to provide decentralized power, or more potentially stability in a local grid if you have to connect into a utility. And then thinking on the community fabric of things, if you could find a community space to put in a solar array, elevate it, and potentially have more space for growing crops, or having a vegetable garden that's accessible for the community, just like power is.
Yeah, and for you, Emmeline, I just wanted to circle back to you because I was thinking about this sort of bigger picture where your vantage point is, and really having a global company covering a lot of different areas of energy. And with the cost reductions happening and the sort of innovations you see both in the technology, but also in the delivery mechanisms that you're working on, what are some of the leading innovations that you see happening in the sector that might start to move the needle for increasing access in developing countries, but also what we just heard in the US?
Yes, so I don't know if I will answer this question the way you want, but, but I would say that technology is here. So it's not, I think it's not a question of innovation on technology. And I think that the main innovation is on the business model and the approach. I'm not speaking about the US, I'm sorry, because our access to energy program is focused on Africa, Asia Pacific, and a little bit in South America also. But so I would say that I wanted to speak about training and support for entrepreneurs also. Because we know that, and that's our approach in the Access to Energy program. We say that technology is not enough, and we also partner with training centers and to build the capacity and to make sure that the jobs that will be created in access to electricity are taken by the people and locally, I would say. And many studies show that millions of jobs can be created, will be created with the access to energy plants in the countries. And there is a figure of 4.5 million jobs that can be created. It's a drop in the ocean of unemployment issue, but it's still a sector that can hire people, so it's to be highlighted. But we know also that those jobs need to be skilled, so training is important. You can't take those jobs from a day to the other. You need to be to have technical training. So it's very important to develop technical training in Africa, in Asia, so that they can be electricians, they can maintain the microgrids. So that is very important, and also support for entrepreneurs. It's very important to support entrepreneurs so that they can build their own company and develop activity at the local level around the microgrid and the solar home systems that are installed in the communities. So that's the main. It's not an innovation. But it's like a holistic approach that is very important to make projects sustainable.
Well, and certainly the workforce development piece in terms of jobs creation and training and financing definitely crosses over into the issues that Byron and Carla are also thinking about. So And my answer to that question would also be it's not the technology. We have the technology, and it's all these other pieces of the value chain that need to be filled in that are probably harder to do and more important in some ways. So I'm just coming to the last question, and then I wanted to wrap up with a couple of things that might be interesting to the students for you guys. And it has to do with policy barriers. And I guess I'll circle back to Byron. There seems to be a lot of interest in agrovoltaics. So maybe you should have a separate community meeting where you talk about agrovoltaics, because there's a lot of questions coming in about that. But in terms of policy barriers that you've seen to scale agrovoltaics initiatives like what you're doing with Jack's Community Garden, are those policy, what are the policy barriers? I know you're tied into Excel, but also Carla could perhaps comment is sort of, are this kind of initiative, the Jack Solar Garden, more challenging on Indigenous lands? And maybe Byron, you have a sense of that, and maybe Carla could also answer it. And in terms of policy barriers, Emily, will wrap up with you sort of talking about policy barriers from your vantage point.
So challenges for agrivoltaics policy-wise is one, land use. Like I mentioned, it took us a year to have the land use code up. I'm sorry, Ellen?
Sorry, you broke up for a sec. It's really thinking about the barriers, the policy barriers to scaling up agrovoltaics that you have encountered or you anticipate encountering.
Yeah, so barriers are local land use codes, zoning for farmland of being able to incorporate it. You have dealing with utilities of, do you interconnect into the utility, or do you have to create your own off-grid source where you have your own substation and all to be able to provide power to select subscribers? You have issues related to the financing, like farms like ours. It's really difficult to come up with $1 million to build a 1 megawatt system. So if you're scaling it to 10 megawatts, like there you go, now over a $20 million kind of project. So it's having governments that have policies that push towards being able to provide or guarantee some sort of financing for farms to be able to incorporate it. Like just slapping on saying $1, like whatever dollar value per kilowatt hour or dollar value per kilowatt of capacity being produced, and making that public information would be a huge help to farms that are interested in creating an agrivoltaic.
Great. And Carla, I'm just mindful of the time, and I think I would like to pivot because I think what Byron talked about also applies to a lot of the Indigenous land ownership and transparency and things of that nature.
I would like to say there's a couple of challenges that are unique in tribal communities that people should be aware of.
Sure.
One is there's a very serious overlay with respect to the federal government, with respect to both rights of way and then leasing permissions for land. And so that's a huge issue, and grid connectivity also kind of related to that. Access to capital is a huge issue. So there's a lot of incentives the government has put out to try to get these projects off the ground, particularly DOE and some within USDA, but they require the tribe to put up matching capital. And so that has been sort of an impediment to unlocking the $2 billion that Congress has appropriated for this. So I think Senator Udall and Congresswoman Deb Haaland have come up with a 30-30 proposal for tribes and getting to renewable energy goals by 2030 that I hope will have some traction within Congress to resolve some of these longstanding issues.
And just briefly, Carla, maybe you could help some of the young people and the students who are on the line. What advice would you give to people interested in getting into the clean energy sector from where your vantage point is on tribal lands and the legal issues and even finance, in terms of skills and what they should be looking for to enter this space? What you found useful?
I mean, there's a whole skill set around, that's very highly technical. And I think that one of the things that you need to know going into this is know what you don't know and make sure that you get the expertise that you need. to walk into a project well. But the most important skill is actually what a lot of people would call a soft skill, but it is the most important, and it's been something that every single person has talked about on this panel today, because it's the core of the work, which is about building good relationships and also really stewarding those relationships throughout the process. And so, you know, reputation, trust, building relationship, listening, true listening, not responsive, postured listening, but really, you know, developing, I think, a competence around really understanding communities and what they need. And I think that's a broad skill that helps in no matter what situation you're in.
Right, and I think it's particularly tough in the COVID setting to do that. It's hugely important, but so hard right now. So hopefully we'll get through this.
Yeah.
And Emmeline, just maybe a couple of words from you on, you know, because you're from a much different global perspective, sort of where you see, you know, the advice for people who are thinking of entering into this space of energy access in developing countries.
Yes.
We're almost out of time.
Yes. No, I have nothing more to add. Carla said it all. Just I know that we all have different lives behind us and different careers. So I think in my part, for example, when I started in my business school, there was absolutely no master degree on sustainability or even access to energy. So I started as a consultant, and then I quit, and I went 2 years in Argentina working for NGOs, and that made me the woman I am today, working with passion for access to energy. So it's better than 2 years of I don't know, master in a big school. 2 years on the ground for NGOs, it's you learn a lot.
Yeah, you get to do a lot of things and learn a lot of different skills in that situation. So I'm going to close it now because it's exactly top of the hour, and I know Julie wants to wrap this up, but thank you all so much for your excellent remarks. And I love the way all of these different aspects were woven together by you, because I think these are just great issues to talk about and very important issues to talk about. So I want to thank my panelists for really taking the time to really be so thoughtful and honest and clear about what we're talking about here. So thank you very much.